Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
In this video, we'll learn how we can customize the issue types in our team managed project. So right now, if we create a new issue in the project that we just created, we only can create a task and an epic. But what if we wanted to create something more, maybe like a story issue type? Remember, that's kind of part of the Kanban template. Well, we can come in here in the project settings under issue type. And when we add an issue type over here on the left side menu, you can see that because we picked that Kanban template, it still has some of those templates for the issue types kind of created for us. So if we wanted a story issue type, all we have to do is to click on the story, click on add, and now we have our story issue type that if we come in here and click on create, we can see we can create this story issue type. And all those fields down below are going to change to whatever the fields are that we select. And that leads right into the next part, as you can probably imagine. Right over here from the left side to the right side, it's kind of how this screen works, is left to right. We can see all the different fields that we have on the story issue type, and we can change whatever we want. So we could add in suggested fields if we want to. So say we do want a due date on this, right? Go ahead and click on Save Changes. And now if we come in and create a new story, we'll see that this now has a due date associated with it, if this is something that we need to show up in the calendar view, things like that. Now, we could just leave it at that. That can be as simple as it is. But what's really cool about this is we can take this to the next level and really further customize this beyond the templates that Jira has for us. So for our purposes today, the project is all about our team developing a podcast app. So beyond the tasks and stories, we can create whatever sort of issue type we want. Maybe we want a way to track new feature requests. So let's add in a new issue type. Create issue type instead of using one of the suggested ones. And let's just give it a name. Let's say this is our new feature. Add in requests for new features in the app. And then we can change the icon. We can have one. If we already have one that we've created, we can do that. Or we can use one of these that Jira has built in, maybe for new feature, new idea. Maybe a light bulb would be a good icon for that. Let's go ahead and select that. Click on Create. And now with this new feature issue type, as you can imagine, we can create, and it's going to show up here. But now let's customize some of the fields that we have, right? So we can pull in some of these suggested fields here, but what if we wanted to actually create a new one? So you can see, actually from my research, let's create this feature location, but rather than just pulling this over that I've already created, let's pull in a drop down, give it a name. And we can say, okay, what are some locations that this new feature might be at? So maybe the now playing screen, podcast library page, the settings page, the discover new shows page, playlist, some of the common areas that would be in an app. And then we can choose what is going to be the default one that's selected when you choose this dropdown. We'll see that in a second. Let's say, just so it's not the top or the bottom, let's make it the settings page kind of in the middle here. And we can rearrange this if we wanted to, of course. If we didn't want it in the middle, we can rearrange all of those. Now, before we save our changes, I do want to point out here at the very bottom, we can make this a required field if somebody were to create a new feature issue type and try to actually create that without using this field. It would not allow it to do that, just like the summary is required that we looked at earlier. And actually, let's go ahead and see that in action. So I'll click on required, save changes. And now that's been created for us. So let's see it in action here. Come into new feature, and we'll see our feature location is chosen. It actually has the settings page as the default, even though it's right in the middle. We can see that in action as well. And then, of course, as you could imagine, if we were to create an awesome feature, have the settings location, and try to create it here, because this is set as the default, it will actually let us create that. You notice that, right? If you want to change that and force the user to actually do that or select one, then we can clear that default. And now if we come in here, another awesome feature. And now if we try to create, it won't let us because that's required. So that's something I want to point out when it comes to creating new fields. If you have required, and then you also have a default, it kind of overrides the required. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're working. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more than just drop downs that we can do when we add fields to our issue types. So I'd encourage you to take some time as you're setting up your team managed project to figure out what fields your team needs to track what types of things that you're going to be tracking in your project, right? So what issues do you need, and the issue types, I should say, that you need, and then the fields underneath them that are going to contain the information that you want on the issues. Now, in our next video, we'll look at how we can continue setting up our team managed project by customizing the Agile board itself. In this video, we'll learn how we can configure the Agile board in a team managed project. So as you can see, now that we know how to create issues, I've just gone ahead and created a bunch of issues just to fill out our project a little bit more so it's not quite so empty. So to get started, let's look at how we can customize our board, because as we're using this day to day, we don't necessarily need to see everybody else's work. And in my own experience, usually people just want to see the issues that are assigned to them on a day-to-day workflow. So to do that, we can use these little profile pictures up here at the top to filter by who the issue is assigned to. So I'm currently logged in as Valerie, as you can see here. So if we want to filter by Valerie's issue, just click on her. Now, what's really cool about this is additive, right? So we can see not only the issues assigned to Valerie, if we want to also see the issues assigned to Ethan, we can add him to this filter. And now we can see both Ethan's issues and Valerie's issues. Or another common workflow that I've done on the board here is to look for all the unassigned issues, because then we can start to filter these off, or I should say, actually delegate them off. And they're going to get removed from the unassigned filter here as we get them done. So it's just a nice way of being able to clear everything unassigned off the board. Over to the right, we have the ability to filter by issue type. And again, this is additive. So let's say we want to see all of the stories that Ethan is working on currently. So we can see anything assigned to Ethan and the story issue type, and the task issue type. And again, this is just a really nice way of being able to see either what's assigned to somebody on your team or to yourself as you're working day to day, to filter on only the things that are relevant to you. Over here on the right-hand side, we can group by a few different things, including assignee. So this is another way of being able to see the board. It's not really necessarily right or wrong. It's what works best for you to have options. So we can see now, if this is grouped by assignee, now on the board we have what would be called swim lanes in Agile terms and Jira terms, are going horizontally across the vertical columns. So now we can see, the unassigned here, and assigned to Sophia, Ethan, and Valerie, and how that works out. And these still work, right? So if we want to only see Ethan, we can see those here. And we can see now unassigned shows no issues because it's all filtered. There we go. Or we can group by subtask. So this is a nice way of being able to see what issues actually have subtasks. So some of these you can see have subtasks. Not all of them, right? So only a couple of them, these issues actually have subtasks in them. So if we open this up, we can see there's child issues underneath this issue. And when we group by subtask, it's showing those on the board there. So just another visual way of being able to see what we need to see right away. Now, the last thing here in the settings I want to point out are these view settings over here, because we can turn on and off different things that we want to be able to see. So watch our cards here. So if I turn off the issue type, you can see now that's turned off, the issue key. So again, if things are a little too cluttered, depending on your monitor resolution and all those kind of things, just a nice way of being able to visually clear up the board to really focus on just what you want to focus on. Now, because we are logged in as the project administrator who created this team managed project, we can take this one step further because we have permissions to configure the actual board with administrative permissions, project administrative permissions. So we can start to add in custom filters that any user roles on our team can use. So to do that, we come up to the top 3 dots over here, come over to Manage Custom Filters. And let's say we want this to be for new features. And let's just keep this simple. Let's just make this another issue type. So the new feature, I need to put that in quotes. There we go. Let the IntelliSense fill that out for me. Go ahead and click on Create. So now we have this here. So if we go back to the board, now we can see our custom filter that we've built, right? So basically it's doing the same thing as some of these built-in features, but I just want to show that you can actually come in and create some custom filters to do pretty much whatever you want. And I'd really recommend you can come in to look at the syntax help. Atlassian has some great documentation on their Jira query language or JQuery that you can use in these filters. So that's one fantastic way that we can customize our Agile board to work faster. Of course, if you're not the project administrator but think a custom filter would help, just ask your project admin to do that. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that we can do as the project administrator is to configure the columns on the Agile board as well. So by default, our Agile board has these 3 columns. If we go back here, we can see, actually, let's minimize the menu there. So we can see we have to do, in progress, and done as the 3 simple columns. So to customize that, let's come in and configure our board. And in here, you can see we have these 3 different columns. Now beneath it, these are the statuses. So to see this, let's actually see this in action. Let's go back to the project itself. And I want to show something. So let's take this issue. And if we open it up, we can see this is currently to do. So this is the issue status is to do. And it's also on the to do column on the board. If I were to take this issue, left click and drag over to in progress, I bet you can guess what's going to happen to the status on the issue. It changes to in progress. We can also change it here. If we change this back to do, it switches back to the to-do column on the board. The reason for that is because of what's configured in here, the columns and statuses. Basically, the columns on the Agile board are mapped to the statuses on the issue. And I say mapped because they are not the same thing. We can really see that if we come in, let's maybe take this column and let's call this working on it instead of in progress, just to call it something else. But you can see the status is still in progress. So if we save our changes, go back to the board, take that same issue, once it loads here, here we go. And you can see we drag it to the working on it column, right? If I add this in here, the status on the issue is actually still in progress. That didn't change. We only changed the name on the column on the board. It just happened to be the same thing. So typically with an Agile workflow, we're going to be working from left to right. So it's going to be, to do, working on it, or in progress. Actually, let's go ahead. Let's rename this back to in progress. We can do that directly on the board here as well, as you can see. So rename that, give it a moment to process. There we go. So just so it's back to in progress there. So typically you're going to be working from left to right on the column. So if we were to wanted to add in a column here, let's add in maybe a review column. And we probably don't want it to be after done because you'd want done to be on the far right side since you work left to right. So let's take this and move it over to here. So now watch what happens when I take this. Take this over here, add it in, and you can see by default, Jira automatically on the back end created a new status for our issue that matches the same name as the column. And as you can guess, we can come back in here to configure the board, and you can see how that is mapped here. Now, we can take this to the next level right? If we want multiple statuses on the same column, you can do that. So watch this. If I were to take this, drag this over to in progress, maybe we can just go ahead and delete this column. So now we have in progress and review on the same column. Watch what happens when we take an issue into that column. We'll have the option to choose which status we want, right? So if you see that happening, that's basically how that's set up on the back end. So if we take an issue and drag it, you can see we can either drag it into review. Try not to let it times out automatically to do that when, but you can see there either in progress or review. So drag it to in progress. There we go. So if we open up this issue, you can see that was the one that was in review. This one here, drag to in progress. And then if we want to take another one and drag it to review, we can see that that's been done there. So just a nice way of being able to control both the columns and the statuses separately to customize that for our team. So on the back end, just so we understand what is happening here beyond the board itself. So this is the board here, but you'll notice this says the statuses for the different issue types, and then we can manage the workflow. So the workflow is what's tied to the issues themselves. So these statuses actually live in the workflow, and we can see, okay, this is what Jira follows. When an issue is created, it's taken to the to-do status. If we want to change that, we can do that. If we want to say, you know what, when an issue is created, instead of being to do, let's make it in progress. Oops, taking that create. There we go, and take it to in progress. Go ahead and update our workflow just so we can see this in action here. And now if we create a new issue, we can see it's going to default to being the in progress status. Now in this case, that was just an example. I'm probably going to want to actually move this back to do because that makes more sense. But now you kind of get an idea of how you can control what statuses the issues are. Now this little any right here, this is the transition. So that's saying that an issue can transition from to do to in progress, from to do to done, from to do to review, and vice versa, because it's any here. You can really start to mix and match and say, actually, we only want it to go from in progress to review. You can't take it from in progress to done because it has to go through the review process or something like that. You can start to really customize that and really build that sort of thing out. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how we can filter our issues using the quick filters on the top of the board, as well as how we can create custom columns and custom statuses using the workflow. Now, I'd encourage you to take some time in between videos to do some playing around with how you can best configure the Agile board for your team. Think about the workflow your team needs. What columns do they need? What statuses? Because they don't have to be a one-to-one mapping as we learned in this video. And when you're ready to move on, we'll learn how we can further tailor our team managed project using Jira's features. And we'll do that in the next video. When we started this section, we created our team managed project using the Kanban template. But what if we wanted the Scrum template instead? Well, in this video, we'll learn how we can use our project's features to make that change. Okay, so actually, you know what? Before we do that, I'm going to do one more thing real quick here that I forgot to do in the last video. In the workflow, I do want to point out here, when you edit the workflow like we did, you can actually come in here and create new statuses. So if we wanted to create maybe an approval status, we can add that there. And then we can drag it to the board over here from anything that's unassigned. So what column do we want it to be associated with? We can drag that in there to show that. So just another way that we can add in a status. In our last video, we created it using the column, which Jira will also create a status for you by default there as well. Okay, so let's go to look at our features. In the project settings, let's go to the features here. So in here are all the features we have available to us for our team managed project. And when we created our project, basically what Jira is doing on the back end is just turning on or off these features based on the template that we picked. So here are the team managed project features. If we pick a Kanban project template, these are the features that Jira turns on. When we pick a Scrum template, these are the features that Jira turns on. Now, if you remember from our last section, when we learned about the differences between Kanban and Scrum, we learned that primarily the differences are sprints. So if we pick a Scrum template and wanted to convert that to a Kanban template, basically we could just toggle on the features to do that. In our case, though, we're doing it the other way since we created a Kanban template first. So basically that means there are 3 features for us to turn on. The backlog here, and then scroll down to sprints and estimation. Now, when it comes to estimating, there are 2 ways that we can do this. Estimating time is straightforward, but story points are another Agile term that Jira just expects you to know. So let's define that real quickly. Story points can be an abstract concept, but one of my favorite ways to define them is similar to the way that your team defines a sprint. We already talked about that. Maybe a sprint is 1 week, maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe even a month. The term sprint is defined by your team to mean something. The same is true for story points, but instead of being the time to get work done, like a sprint overall, the story points refer to how much effort it will take to get something done. That also includes the time itself, but therefore the issues instead of the overall sprint. So it goes beyond just the time estimates. For example, let's say we have a user story that will take 6 hours for the developer to do, but then it's got to go through QA, so that's going to add a little bit more time. And what if we have to run it by an external client as well? It's almost impossible to calculate how much time they're going to take, but the story is starting to get a lot more complex than just the time to build the functionality. That level of uncertainty jumps higher than if it's something that you can just knock out by yourself in a few hours. So that's where story points come into play more than just the time itself for a single person to do it, because it can be a unit to help try and capture all of that into a single estimate. An estimate is the key word there because no one can predict the future exactly. So that is an example of story points that Jira is referring to right here, which estimation we want to use. And again, it's an Agile term, so it's not unique to Jira. So there are a lot of great resources where you can read up on the benefits or pros and cons of using story points versus time estimation in Agile. So you can start to figure out how to define that for your team. For our purposes today, though, let's go back to our board in Jira. And now back on our board, you can immediately tell that it's different. So we can see now Jira wants us to start a sprint. So you may not have noticed it when I opened the menu really fast, but we actually have a backlog now. And in the backlog, we have sprints. And if we were to open up one of these issues, now we can start to add our story point estimates. So if we add an estimate to this, you can see that gets tracked there, and we drag it into the sprint, and you can see that estimate starts to fill up. Now, if we go back to the settings in here, there are a lot more features in here that we didn't get a chance to talk about, and I'd encourage you to mix and match some of these to determine which features your team needs the best. And as we learned in this video, at any time, you can always come in here to turn them on or off. So maybe try some features out with your team. And if they end up not helping, maybe just causing too much visual clutter on the screen even, then you can always come in here and turn them back off. Okay, so in the last few videos, we've really focused on the Agile board because that's one of the core areas that we'll be using in Jira. After you've looked at the rest of the features here in Jira, we'll see you in the next video where we'll learn more about some of them, starting with the timeline view. In this video, we'll learn how to use the timeline view in a team-managed project. So let's head over to our project here, and on the left-hand side, we will find the timeline. Before we click on this, though, I do want to point out on the board, we've already looked at these filters up here, but we also have those same filters on the timeline view. And they do the exact same thing, being able to filter by assignee or unassigned, or you can see we can filter by the status. And if you recall from our previous video, when we actually created our custom filter for the Agile board, it shows up on the timeline as well. Now, in the last section, we learned about stories and epics. And epics are key to the timeline view because they are how really everything is organized on here. So let's create some epics to see how this will work. So I'm going to create a new epic, and this will be to make sure that we get the core podcast playback and controls done. And maybe one for the podcast discovery, if I can spell this screen, and then for offline, just to have a couple of them in here. There we go. And I'm just typing and then hitting enter, and then Jira will automatically create that issue and then jump down to the new one so we can very quickly add these in. So now that we have the epics created, if you recall, epics are basically the parents of the issues underneath them. We learned about user stories in particular, because that's another Agile term. But any of the standard issue types that we have in Jira can be the children of epics. So to create a child issue, if we hover over, you'll notice the plus sign here, just to create that. And now we can just type in the summary. This is going to fill out the summary field of this story issue type. We can change the issue type if we want, but I'm good with story. Go ahead and type that out and then hit enter. And we can see Jira has created that story underneath the epic. So now that you've seen how these get added, I'm going to pause the video for a moment while I finish building these out so we can see how they will look on the timeline with just a few more data points to look at. Okay, so now we have a few more epics and stories added, and these are really just issues, the same as if we had created them using the create button up here at the top like we've done in the past. The timeline view just gives us a really quick way of being able to create issues in the timeline itself. And once we have these added, the idea for the timeline view is to work kind of like a Gantt chart where we can plan out the order of things to get done. If we're working on sprints, we can add these epics into sprints. If not, they're just based on time. So if we hover over, you'll notice the time here. We can see the 14 days, and we can just click and start to add in our timeline view. Maybe let's dial these up a little bit just so it's easier to see. And then over on the left and right side, as you can probably guess, you can expand or make smaller based on however long you want. And really all that Jira is doing on the back end, if we were to open up this issue here and scroll down, you can see really it's just adjusting the start date and the due date for this issue. So if we were to hover over, you can see that's 11/10/2024. If we want to change this specifically to something else, we can do that, and that will update on the timeline view as well. So now that we have some time added to these epics, we can actually add time to the child issues, the stories as well, if we really want to get granular with how we plan out our timeline. You'll notice this is saying, oh, wait, actually, the parent needs to be longer than, because the epic is supposed to be inclusive of all of the children, right? So we would want to extend that if we think that the child issues are going to run past either the end or the start. You'll see that as well. So you can start to see the power of just being able to view this in a timeline view. There are a couple other things I do want to point out. So if we right click on this, we can just clear the dates very quickly. If you do end up getting a lot of them going past, or you just need to start over, that's just a quick way of being able to do that. Clear both dates, right click. And on the epics, if you right click, not only can you remove the start and due dates, clear the dates, but you can also change the colors, again, to just visually help see some differences between them as you're starting to build out your timeline. Now, the last thing I want to point out when it comes to epics is this little visual indicator that we have here, right? So we can see it's really tough to see if you look closely, that little gray bar. So that's kind of an indicator of how much we have done. So if we open up one of these issues here and just change it to be done, you can see how that bar updates, right? Maybe let's do another one so we can see a little bit easier. So watch this bar here. See the green? That's the done. 4 of 5 are left to do. So 1 is done. And now you can see the status bar in the epics is updating to reflect that some of these issues are done. It just gives another way of being able to visualize the work that's being done. And that's how the timeline view works in Jira. Now, in our next video, we'll look at another way for us to visualize our work inside of team managed projects with the calendar view. See you there.
Hi, from everyone at Simon Says It. We hope you're enjoying this training lesson. Please like this video to show your support for the channel. If you want to take your learning further, earn a certificate for this course, and gain access to over 200 courses ad-free, click up there and go to simonsaysit.com. Thanks for watching, and back to the course.
In our last video, we added dates to issues in the timeline view. In this video, we'll look at another way to visualize that in the calendar view. Now, as we talked about before in the overview, as I'm recording this, the calendar is a new view. So obviously, if you're using an older version of Jira, you might not have access to it. But because we added dates in our last video, this is basically just showing us the start and due date fields, just like we saw in the timeline. So if we open up this epic here, we can see the start and due date. Actually, let's make this something a little bit closer so we can see the entirety of our epic here. Something like that. There we go. So now we can see the whole thing. And now, just like you would expect, and in the similar to the timeline view, we can drag from the ends to change those dates however we may want. We can also just take the whole thing and move it around. If we move it into the past, you can see it's going to say, oh no, it's overdue, turn red and let us know. So the calendar view works a lot like any other calendar that you're already familiar with. But when it comes to Jira, perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind about the calendar view is that the only issues we'll see in here are the ones that have dates associated with them. So if we were to open up this epic, we can see there's a lot of other stories underneath the epic that we created that are not showing up on the calendar. If we want them to show up on the calendar, we have to associate a date with them. So let's open up one of these and we have the due date field here. Let's add a due date and then go back to the calendar view and we'll see that show up in this view. Let's drag it over here so it has its own. It's just a little bit easier to visually see with the monitor resolution that I have. And then the same is true if we open this up and just remove the date, it'll disappear from the calendar view. But it's not actually being deleted, it's just disappearing from this view. Now, before we wrap up, I do also want to point out that we have some of the same filters that we've seen in the other views up here at the top. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going through them, but obviously the filters here are more associated with a calendar, right? So we can search just like we've seen before. So if we wanted to filter by only things that say have the word podcast in them, we can filter. It's going to remove anything there. We can filter by the type, so issue type, if we only want to see the tasks, perhaps, right? We can filter by those, as well as by status, assignee, or any other sort of indicator. There's a whole lot of other fields, basically, is what we're filtering by, any of the fields, right? Really, really cool and powerful stuff that we can do here on the calendar view with the filters. So that is a look at the calendar view. It is a lot like what you would expect from any other sort of calendar, but it can be a great way to visualize and tweak the dates for our issues. Now, in our next video, we'll look at yet another way to visualize our issues in team managed projects with the list view. In this video, we'll get an overview of how the list view works in Jira's team managed projects. So the list view is exactly what we'd expect from a list of issues in Jira. And now that we've looked at a lot of the other views, the way that this is organized should look familiar too. Up here at the top, we have the same search box and the ability to filter this list based on the assignees, just like we saw in the other views. And these are additive, just like we saw in the other views. And you'll notice the list itself looks a lot like Excel. And we can actually format this based on rules a lot like Excel also. So let's say we want to see all of the unassigned issues in yellow, just to highlight them a little bit. There we go. So we create a rule. Assignee is unassigned, will be a yellow row. And what happened to the formatting? Where is it? Well, that brings up a very good point with how lists work, is that the formatting will not show up if the field is not visible. So up along the top here of our list, we have the field as columns, basically. And we were formatting based on the assignee. So we need to add in the assignee field. Now, once that's there, you can see our formatting is applied. We can also visualize this a little bit easier by going to assignee, right? So we can do that if we want. Just other ways of being able to visualize our data. Now, what's really cool about this is because all inside of Jira, we can customize this list and then share it with others on our team. So let's say we want to share all the stories that were created this week with somebody else. So I'm going to clear this out and let's filter all of these stories that were created from Sunday to Saturday. There we go. Have that applied. Now, when we share this with somebody else, there's a key thing to keep in mind. This formatting that we've done does not get shared. So let me show you what I mean. If I share this with Ethan and then log in, so this is logged in as Ethan here, you can see. That will show up in our notifications. Might take a second for it to show up. Refresh the page here. And we'll give it a second for this to show up. There we go. So we have the list that Valerie shared. And when we open this up, you'll notice we can see assignee, but that formatting is not there. Same with the columns. If you look at the columns, right? So this goes all the way over to team, parent, but the columns that Valerie has are not the same. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you share the list. The list itself is the same. The issues on the list are the same because the same filters are being applied. We can see this filter here, story created. And then on Ethan's side, I'll pull this up a little bit easier to see. It's also filtering by the stories that were created. So it is the right list. It's the same list. It's just that some of the formatting doesn't come through. Hopefully Atlassian will fix that in the future, but that's something to keep in mind for now. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how to filter the list view, customize the columns we see, and share our list with another user on the team. In the next video, we'll switch gears a little bit to learn about forms in Jira. In this video, we'll get an overview of how the forms work in Jira. So a great way to think of forms is to think of something like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, except this is built directly into Jira. So as you can probably guess by now, the information that gets gathered is automatically added into an issue. Sounds pretty cool, right? Let's see how this works. So let's hop over to our project and we'll find the forms over on the left side. Now, as you can see, as of this recording, forms is also a new feature. So as I've mentioned before, if you're using an older version of Jira, you might not have access to this yet. So to start, we have to tell Jira what issue type we want this to be when it gets created. So because we just created a project for developing a podcast app, let's use this form to kickstart some feature ideas by asking everyone else in our organization what they love about the podcast apps they're already using. With that purpose for the form identified, it would make the most sense for the issue type to be the new feature issue type that we created earlier. And let's give this a title, better title, I should say. Podcast app ideas, and maybe a description. Next, we need to decide what fields we want to show up on the form. And if these fields look familiar, there's a reason for that. These are the fields that we have on the new feature issue type. But we don't have to show them all. Just like when we're creating a new issue, we don't have to fill everything out. We don't have to show all the fields on the form either. So we can add in field, just drag it over. We can rearrange it however we want to. We can remove fields if we want. We can rename them. So maybe we want, rather than saying this is the summary, let's say this is a brief description. And then make this a long description, something like that. Maybe we want to prioritize the attachment. And actually, let's call this a screenshot. So we can say, can you screenshot like that? So we can get an actual visual of what the feature is that they love so much. Okay, I think that'll get the info that we need. Now, there are a few different ways that we can share this. We can use the default share button to send this to people directly in Jira, or we can just preview this and then share that link that we get with the form, share it with anybody in our organization through email, Slack, Teams, or anything else. And I'm saying our organization for a reason, because this is actually creating an issue in the project. So whomever is filling this out will have to have permissions to do that in our Jira project. And that's exactly what this little notification up here is telling us, that right now the permissions on our project won't let anyone fill out the form because no one will be able to create issues in the project. So there are two places that we can go to check this. The first is in the project settings with the permissions on the project in access. And here you go. So right now the project is set to private. So we probably want to set this to open. So anyone with access to Jira overall can access this, or we can do limited if we want only some of these people in the project. Let's save and make open. Now, if we go back to our forms, the other place that we can go to look for permissions on the form is right here. So we can say anyone with permissions to create items in this project or anyone who can log in. So maybe we want to make this completely open so anybody in the organization can see this form. And then the process of filling it out is pretty straightforward. So if we were to go through and actually fill this out, maybe say archiving episodes. You even have a screenshot here that we can attach. Drop that in. Add in a long description of what that feature is. Submit that. And then if we hop back into Jira, go back to our issues, we can see that issue shows up that just got created. It's a new feature issue type. It's got the attachment. It's got the form filled out. And if you notice over here on the right side, Jira automatically added the label form so that if we wanted to search for it in here in the issue navigator, it'd be a lot easier to find. Actually, we haven't really talked much about how to use this view to find things. So let's move on to our next video where we'll do exactly that. In this video, we'll learn how to use the issue navigator in Jira. Now, the issue navigator is probably one of the most fundamental views in Jira. And I say that because it's probably been around the longest. When we looked at the calendar view, for example, we learned that's a newer view. The timeline, which used to be called the roadmap, is also a newer view, and so on. Well, the issue navigator has been around pretty much since the beginning of Jira. Of course, its layout has changed quite a bit since then. So let's start by getting familiar with how it's laid out. So along here at the top, we have filters, a lot like what we've seen in the other views, except here in the issue navigator, these are a lot more powerful filters. We can see all the different things that we can filter by. And we're actually going to look at these in a lot more depth in our next section because this issue navigator view is something that we'll be using heavily in company managed projects. But when we filter, use the top to filter, this is the list of issues along the left side. So if we want to look for just the stories, we can see that now it's filtered 1 of 23, just the stories. We can even minimize the left side menu to see that a little bit easier. Then over here, the bulk of this view is showing the fields within the issue. So we learned in the last section that fields live on issues, and these are all the fields that live on each of these issues. And one reason why the issue navigator is so powerful is that not only can we see the fields here. We can find the issues, see the fields on the issues, but we're going to be making a lot of changes to the data held by fields. For example, if we wanted to change this summary, we could just go in there and type it and do it. This is where we're going to make a lot of these changes to these different issues. And of course, we can update any of the fields on the issue, but there are a few things here that can be easily overlooked to help us work more efficiently. First, we have our comments by default, but we also have the all activity, we have history, and we have the work log. So the comments are pretty straightforward. The only thing to point out here is that you can mention users. So if we tag somebody, then what that will do is send them a notification up here with a link to this comment. Then we have the history. Now in the history tab, we can see any of the changes that have been made to the issue. For example, if we were to reassign this to someone else, we're going to assign this to Ethan. Now that will show up in the history. Might need to refresh there. There we go. We can also see the work log. So by default, there's not automatic time tracking in Jira, but any user can add the time that they've worked on the issue to show up here. So if we want to say, maybe we spent an hour building the initial functionality, and we can see that show up here. So now that we know what these three are, this all activity makes a lot more sense. It's basically these three activity items in one log. Now over here on the right side, we have the fields on our issue that we can update. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but I want to point out that because we are an admin on this team managed project, we can control the fields right here without going to the project settings. If we click on this little gear, we can create a field. Let's find an operating system, and oh, that's field type drop down. I was typing it in the wrong field. There we go. Creating the field, and then we can add in the option since it's a drop down. Just add a couple. So we can see, you can see Jira is automatically saving this. So now we have this field added to our issues. And if this is a field that we use a lot, we can pin this to the top to make it easier to find. And not only is it going to be pinned on this one issue, but any of these issues. Now, if you remember from our first video in this section, we learned that the fields in Team Managed Project are project scoped entities. That means that this new field is only going to be in this one project. And we'll look at how we can create fields that are used across multiple projects in Jira, because that's how company managed projects work. But in our team managed project, this field exists on all of these issues here that we can see. Now, the last thing I want to point out in this video has to do with being able to quickly hop to the overall field management that we saw in an earlier video. So if we did want to get rid of this field, we can come down here and configure, and that will show us this view that we've been to before. We can find this field, drop it off, save those changes. And now if we go back to the issue, now that field is going to be gone. Oh, looks like it didn't take me back there. Let's go back to our project. And there we go. Yep, that field has been removed. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned how the issue navigator is organized. We learned how to update fields, see the issue history and activity logs, as well as how we can create and manage the fields on the issues right here in the issue navigator. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk much about the filters up here, but these filters work exactly the same in the team managed projects as they do in the company managed projects. So instead of repeating the same information twice, if you want to learn more about finding and searching for issues in the issue navigator, we'll be covering that a lot more in the company managed projects section of this course. For right now, though, you might have noticed that we went from forms to issues and we skipped over goals. So let's learn about those in our next video. In the last couple of videos, you might have noticed that we went from forms to issues in Jira's left side menu. And in this video, we'll fill in that gap by learning about goals. Before we do that, let me fix this typo here because that's bothering me. And we can head on over to goals. Goals are basically a central place where you can see a bigger picture of how the work is helping to hit that goal. Now, before we start, as I'm recording this, goals are in beta. They're not even available for everyone yet. And to be upfront, I have no idea when Atlassian will roll them out, but I wanted to make sure that we touch on them so you're a little more familiar with them for whenever your Jira instance gets access. So to create a goal right now, we actually have to go outside of Jira and go into a place called Atlassian Home. And then we can come in and create a goal, either using this or using the create button up here at the top. And since this is for a podcast app, let's say the goal is to publish the podcast app in the App Store. We can select a target date, go ahead and create that. So now that we have a goal created, you'll notice that we have this whole other interface where we can link issues, projects, and things from inside Jira to the goal. So maybe we have a project to get the app designed, another for the dev team to build the functionality, and then we can tie together the epics from different projects to the goal as a way of tracking it all, sharing updates across all the teams, and so on. And here's where it can get really confusing because goals is outside of Jira right now. So when you see it talking about a project, it's not talking about the team managed project that we just created. This is a completely different project, and we can see this project created in Atlassian Home. If we create this project and then head back over to Jira and look at all projects, it doesn't show up anywhere because it's not actually a Jira project. And that's where it can start to get to be a little bit confusing. Now, one of the things we can do in our team managed project is to link issues to the goal. And that's really the primary reason why we see them in our menu in the team managed project. So if we were to go into one of these issues, we can see we need to actually add that field. I don't think we've added that yet. No, we haven't added the goals field. So let's add the goals field to the story issue type. And then if we go back, now we'll see the goals. We can pin that so it's a little bit easier to see. And we can look for that goal that we just created. There we go. So we have that added. And then over here in Atlassian Home, we can go to Jira to see what issues are currently contributing to this goal, to achieving this goal. So as you can see, at the end of the day, goals are just another way of being able to track our work. Okay, so to recap, in this video, we learned that goals aren't really a part of team-managed projects or even company-managed projects or even Jira itself, if you think about it, since it takes us out of Jira to access them. But they are in beta, so I really hope that Atlassian will start to integrate them better. And now you've got a better idea of what goals are and how they work. And I encourage you to play with goals between videos to see if maybe there's something that your team can use, or maybe by the time you're watching this, Atlassian has started to integrate them a little bit better. And when you're ready, I will see you in our next video where we'll wrap up this section by taking everything that we've learned so far and using it in an example daily workflow in our team managed project. See you there. In this video, we'll take everything we've learned so far and go through an example daily workflow in a team managed project. Now, if you recall from our Agile Crash Course video, we learned about something called a stand-up. And in my experience, usually that's what you do first thing in the morning. So on the board, if we come to the top right, we can start our stand-up. And you can customize the time, of course, depending on the size of your team, how many team members you have. But the basic process here is that each team member gets a couple minutes to answer these 3 questions. And inside of Jira, during the stand-up, we can see what things are assigned to that team member as they're answering the question. The questions are, what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And are there any blockers preventing progress? This is one of the ways that an agile workflow helps everyone be on the same page about all the work that's being done. Again, the concept of a stand-up meeting is not unique to Jira, but in the newer versions of Jira, they added this nice little view to help the stand-up be more effective. And as the timer ticks down, by default, we'll hear the little ticker to let everyone know as they're talking it's time to wrap up. And then you can move on to the next person and repeat the process. So for Valerie, let's pull one of these issues over for her to work on today. There we go. And as the timer hits 10 seconds, we'll hear that noise. There we go. So now we move on to the next person. The timer will automatically start and the process repeats. So in our example here with 3 people on the team, even if we left the timer at the default of 2 minutes, that's a quick 6-minute meeting that'll help provide clarity around what everyone got done the day before, what everyone is doing today, what sort of roadblocks someone is facing to help clear them if possible, or at least to know why something isn't being completed. Now, when everyone has had a chance to go, you end the stand-up and everyone gets to work for the day. So ending the stand-up is as easy as coming up here, go end stand-up, and it'll take you back to the Agile board. Now, we've looked at a lot of the different views that we can use throughout this section, but in my experience, the Agile board is where most of our work will be getting done on a day-to-day basis. And the basic process in an Agile workflow is to take an issue from left to right. So you notice we took it from to do to in progress to work on for that day. And then when we're done with it, drag it into done. And you'll notice that when we drag it into done, Jira automatically set this issue to resolved, which is why the issue key on this one is crossed out. And then once it's done, you pick the next issue that you decided to work on in the stand-up or sprint if you're working in a Scrum workflow, and continue on. Of course, that is in an ideal situation. As we all know, things are not going to be ideal every single day. So Jira does have a few cool things that we can do when that happens. So let's say we're working on an issue throughout the day, and there's another issue that is blocking our ability to get this one done for whatever reason. Well, what we can do is we can let people know that this issue is blocked. So let's say this one is blocked by this one here. If we come into the little dots here, we can link issue and say it's blocked by app 10. That's this issue here. Link that. And now when we have our stand-up, we can open this up and look at it and say, oh, that one's blocked. That's why. And then we have that conversation of, do we have any roadblocks in the stand-up that we just learned? And there are other links that we can add too, but blocking an issue is really helpful because once this is blocked, it'll show up for everyone on the board on the insights to see that this issue is blocked. Or maybe it's not really blocked. Maybe as we're working on it, we just need to raise attention. Well, you'll notice we can actually add a flag to, let's talk about this in stand-up, something like that. And not only does it visually change the color, but it also adds a flag there, and it will show up in our board insights under the flagged tab as well. So that's a great way to make sure that something gets brought up in the next daily stand-up or sprint if we're working in a Scrum workflow. Okay, and with that, we've come to an end of this section learning all about team-managed projects. Now, if you recall, we learned at the beginning of this section that team-managed projects have project scope entities. So let's see that real quick in action. If we were to come in here to projects and create a new project, let's do this same thing that we did before. We're rushing through this because we've done this before. There we go. So I'm creating a new project, new team managed project. And now, once we actually get into this project, we'll notice that some of the issues, the issue types, I should say, don't even exist in here. So if we come into our project settings, as we can see, the new feature issue type that we created in the other team managed project is not there because it only lives in that project we created it in. That's because of the project scope entities. Now, that can certainly be a great thing in some cases, But depending on the size of our organization, there's a good chance that your team is sharing entities across company-managed projects.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.